We're going to be in Genesis chapters 7 to 9 today. So 7, 8, 9. Before that, very quick summary. So we started in Genesis chapter 1, and that is when we had the 6 days of creation, as well as a little bit of background information, such as the Mosaic authorship, and some other little things. But mostly the 6 days of creation. Genesis 2 got us into the 7th day, which was the rest day, and it also got us into the very start of our large outline. So if I go ahead and bring up that outline right now, and I don't know if you can hear my dogs barking, but they're very distracting, as usual. But anyway, here's the quick outline for Genesis. If you read through Genesis and look at every first verse that's listed in the outline, you'll see that they all start with the account of, or the generations of, such and such. And the specific word there is toledot in the Hebrew, and that begins in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. The account of the heavens and the earth. And that starts at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, if you can take a look at that if you want. And that extends all the way to the end of chapter 4. So the heavens and the earth, we get the specific creation of man and woman in chapter 2. And then we get into chapter 3, where we have the fall of man. So just the very next chapter, after their specific creation, now they have fallen. They ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that they were told not to eat. After that, and well, kind of in chapter 3, we get the first major prophecy. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. This is the curse to the serpent. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. And we saw some very strong messianic overtones with that, and the fulfillment of that prophecy in Jesus Christ. Chapter 4 gets us into Cain and Abel, some of the sons of Adam and Eve, and they offered their sacrifices. Cain offered some grain, well, we don't really know exactly what it is, but from crops, basically, through the ground. And Abel brought forth an offering from his fields and flocks. And God had regard for Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's sacrifice. We looked at why that was specifically. And long story short, Cain killed his brother Abel. He was cursed for it. Chapter 5, we got into the descendants of Adam. So just a fairly long genealogy. We looked at some of the patterns in this genealogy and some exceptions in this pattern. So all of them died, basically, except for Enoch. And Enoch provides us this kind of first ray of hope, where we see all this death, this destruction, these curses, all this bad stuff, and yet there is still hope, because God is still sovereign over life and death. And then we get into Lamech in verse 28, and he's the only one who has a little bit of dialogue in the whole genealogy. Lamech had a son, and he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed." So that's kind of the second ray of hope that we see. Even after all this death and destruction, this work, this toil, this cursing, Lamech is still, hopeful here. Chapter 6, we got into the corruption of mankind. They were very evil. They did very bad things throughout time, and yeah, it is a fast summary. But yeah, a lot of evil going on in chapter 6, and the sons of God were having relations with the daughters of men, making even more evil. We looked at what those two things could signify. Perhaps we're talking about the descendants of Seth as the sons of God, kind of more on the strong believers of God. And the daughters of men then would probably be daughters of Cain, kind of on the bad side of things. Or you could be talking about angelic/demonic beings for the sons of God, and daughters of men would just be regular old people. Any questions on the summary? Alright, I will assume no questions. If you want to be called on to read, just go ahead into the Bible Study React channel. I've linked that down below, and just react to the message there, and I will have a list of people whom I will call on to read. So I see Matthew's reaction on there first. Matthew, could you please read chapter 7, all of it, verses 1 to 24.
Genesis, which chapter again? Sorry?
Chapter 7.
Genesis chapter 7. Okay, 1 second. We'll use the ESV, Genesis 7. The whole chapter, okay. A little sip of water. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, and the male and his mate. And 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth, and 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood, of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground. 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days the waters of the flood came upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. And rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife with the 3 wives of his sons with them, entered the ark. They and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, every winged creature. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. I'm sorry, I was just reading over that again. That's how it words it. That's interesting. Anyways, verse 17. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days.
Perfect, thanks. So that was chapter 7 of Genesis. Chapter 6 kind of provided the groundwork for the ark and everything in Noah. And chapter 7, we see that the ark has been finished already, and they're going inside along with a bunch of animals and with a bunch of food as well that we saw earlier. I think it was in chapter 6 too. And they've gotten inside the ark. They've been shut in by God himself, closed the door behind them, or whatever kind of mechanism they had for that entrance. God shut it, and then the flood began. So you can outline this section in a number of different ways. Real quickly, here is a chiasm, as many of you will get flashbacks from our Proverbs study, but there's a big chiasm going on here. It's kind of hard to spot because it's not all, here's one verse and then here's the next verse. There are kind of jumps in the chiasm, kind of longer sections. But here's the chiasm. I just pasted the outline there. That's from Kenneth Matthews' commentary in the New American Commentary series. But you can kind of see how it's outlined by the number of days. So you had 7 days of waiting for the flood, and a little verse reference there. Then you had 7 days of waiting for the flood mentioned again. Then you had 40 days of the flood, and then you had 150 days of water triumphing over the earth. And if you remember with a chiasm, you had the pattern in the first half, and then you had that pattern reversed. So you could have A, then B, and then you reverse that pattern in the second half, B, and then A. So we have that reversed pattern right after that, 150, then 40, then 7, then 7. And if you draw vertical lines between each of those things, so 7 days of waiting for the flood, draw a vertical line from the 7 all the way down to the 7 at the bottom, 7 days wait. Then you can draw another vertical line there, and you'll see 7, 7, 7, 7, 40, 40, and 150, 150. So that's just an easy way that you can kind of remember this section. It spans to kind of midway through chapter 8. But any questions or any comments that you guys had?
The only thing I'll mention is I think it's interesting that it mentions all the creeping things, because I can just imagine, without the divine providence of God preserving life, how would Noah on his own been able to have catch all those bugs? So
Yeah.
I do believe that them all coming in the ark 2 by 2 would be definitely of divine providence. If that, like, you imagine the one male, one female cockroach just walking in the ark, it's like, okay, like some people have speculated that he went out and like got them, but I'm like, it says that they went 2 by 2 into the ark. I don't think you can tell ants to go 2 by 2 into the ark, like one male, one female, or something. Like, I thought that was just interesting.
Yeah, it sure is. And I liked what you pointed out. We do get this sense that, yeah, Noah's probably doing a little bit there, but we see the animals and creeping things seem to go into the ark of their own accord. By divine providence, of course. But yeah, good stuff. So Eli asks, does the Bible say anything about 7 being the perfect number, or is it just implied all throughout? I mean, yeah, there's a bit about that. Nothing in Genesis, though. You don't see... Well, I mean, there kind of is, definitely an implication, at least, but you don't really see 7 being the perfect number explicitly in Scripture, but you do see it as a very important number. The days of creation, 7th day of rest, and then we see some 7 days of waiting in the ark story. Mosquitoes. We can lament about that. Yeah, you can certainly put dates on that. This goes back to our age of the earth kind of whole thing. And it also goes to the question of, was the flood local? Meaning that it was kind of restricted to this one area, smaller than a continent perhaps, just kind of Noah's area, or was the flood global? Is the two main options there. And I like what Matt said about the creeping things. Not really what he said, but that he mentioned it, about the creeping things. If we do look at that language, the creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, every bird of its kind, I'm reminded of the same kind of language that's been used in the creation of all animals on all over the earth in Genesis chapter 1, which, if we do look at the word earth, though, we do see that it can mean a localized area. It can also simply mean dirt and things like that, but it can also refer to the entire capital E, earth, the entire world, as it did in Genesis chapter 1 and the chapters of creation. And those are the two main options. I would definitely lean toward a global flood as well as a young earth. But I know some people here, and that's fine, they hold to an old earth, and they might even hold to a localized flood as well. Global to cover the mountains? Yeah, that's another interesting one. And if you do consider a local flood, you have to wonder, how was that flood localized and didn't just kind of fall into the ocean after that? Always everywhere. That's a possibility. There are some difficulties you have to overcome, though, in the global flood idea, such as, okay, if the flood was global, how did the land animals and creepy crawlies then move to all the other different continents and things like that? And there are solutions to that, such as land bridges, and such as, well, at that period of time, even immediately after the flood, all the continents were still connected at that time. And there's an interesting name later on that we'll read in Genesis, a guy named Peleg. And he was named Peleg because in his days the earth was divided, and perhaps that refers to the continents being split apart into kind of what we have today. So Snorlax says it could have been local because the only human populated area was around the Mediterranean Sea. That's definitely a possibility. We don't really know that for sure, though, how far they spread out exactly. In chapter 11, of course, we do see them majorly spreading out. So yeah, it could have been local. That's probably the main controversy that we'll get to. There's a little controversy later on, next chapters though. But I do have some questions for you guys. We had just read Genesis chapter 7, if you've just joined. And my first question is, what does the flood tell us about God? What do you guys think? So yeah, he has full control over his creation, and he's just. Feel free to use your microphones if you want to, by the way. Text is fine too. God is patient, but will also bring a day of sudden justice and holy wrath. So yeah, it's important to keep this context in mind, that all the people were extremely evil. Go ahead, Dogman.
Oh, yeah, he doesn't tolerate sin.
That's for sure. And I want to bring up some comparisons to ancient Near Eastern literature now, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic. The reason, and these were other flood accounts too, going on at the time, but the main reason for the flood in those other accounts outside of Genesis was that the gods were annoyed because human beings were very noisy. That was the reason given for wiping them all out and killing them all. We do have that contrast, though, where we see the God of Genesis as being just. He's patient, he's just, but he doesn't tolerate sin. And sin was the reason, not that humans were waking him up from his nap or whatever, something very petty like that, but that they were doing extreme evil. So my next question is, what does the flood tell us about man? We already got some good stuff about God, but what does the flood tell us about man now? We're bad? Yeah? We're small.
I think like there's yes, we were worth saving. I think that's all true. I think it also says that, in us there's the breath of life, and there is a sense of, like, God didn't have to preserve the trees or the mountains or the snow. He had to preserve things that were alive. And I think also, that the whole start of the story is that Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. He was the only righteous one left. It's like a kind of repeat with Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot. It's like he was, Abraham said, if there's 5 righteous in the city, spare the city. There wasn't 5 righteous. And if you think about that, that's pretty interesting, because there was Lot, his wife, his 2 daughters, and then there was their fiancés. So even their fiancés were not righteous. Even his wife looked back when they were leaving the city, and even his daughters eventually were sinful. So I think they were sinful at the time. So there wasn't even 5 righteous. So God brought down the judgment on the whole city, but saved Lot and his family for, his sake, meaning in the sense of from the physical destruction. So point being, God saved Noah and his family and they were righteous, and they were honoring to God. So that's a kind of rant. I'm sorry. Sometimes my thoughts seem very clear, and then I start talking, and I'm not sure if they are. So,
But yeah, that was good. Liked what everyone else
Thank
said
you.
too. Good
Yep.
stuff. And my final question, and Matt was already kind of answering this, but for everyone else too, what does the Ark and Noah tell us about God? So to repeat the question, what does the Ark and Noah tell us about God?
That God makes a way of salvation for the righteous. Oh, that's what Lee just said.
Yeah.
God prepared an ark for them to go into, and the ark is a foreshadowing of Christ. That we who enter in, we will be saved from God's wrath and God's judgment on the day of judgment. And I think that's also a thing that Noah was able to live righteously, even though no one else was. It's like that hymn, I have decided to follow Jesus, no turning back. So I think that's two things I notice. And that God has provided a means of salvation for the righteous, and God has not forgotten the righteous. There's a verse later where it says God remembered Noah, and I think that's important to point out because God hadn't forgotten. But what it was saying, and we'll read it next time, but what it was saying is, that God, in his mercy, he had thought of them. And, they got out of the ark and stuff like that. So, point being, in Christ we have a means of salvation from the wrath of God, which wickedness deserves, but we have been forgiven and shown mercy.
Yeah, I liked all of that. And the other answers too. We're here by grace and love. Shows God's love for his creation, although his creation did turn on him. And he rightly enacted the flood. And I think you were referring to maybe 1 Peter 3:20, Matt. For Christ also died for sins once for all. That's verse 18. The just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh. And then Peter gives this illustration with the ark in verse 20, who once were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. And he uses that as an illustration for baptism.
Amen. Thank you for bringing up that verse.
Yeah, very good stuff. All right, we will get on to chapter 8 now. And Trinity was the next person to react. So Trinity, could you please read all of chapter 8 for us?
Okay, this is ESV. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. The flood subsides. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days the waters had abated, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. And the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her foot, so she returned to him to the ark, where the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove back out of the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him any more. In the 601st year, in the 1st month, on the 1st day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. And the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife, and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by families from the ark. God's covenant with Noah. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever strike down every creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease."
All right, thank you. So that was chapter 8, and now the flood is subsiding, it's abating, and finally Noah and his family can get out. So real quickly, just so that we can get into chapter 8, that Solus Spiritus had a question there. Like, he uses us as an ark, perhaps, for saving people when we spread Jesus. Are we symbolically an ark for the rest of people? That's a good question. And real quickly, just so that we can get into chapter 8, I would say no, because the ark is a vessel of divine protection. God shut the ark closed in Genesis, and in 1 Peter, we see that God is using the ark. It's not Noah and his family who are saving themselves, or us saving ourselves through a good conscience and things like that, or through baptism, but it is God saving us. So it's a vessel of divine protection. I don't think we can take that place of that, because it's all of God's work. Salvation is God's work, and it's his protection that he puts on people. And I would also say that I don't think we can use the word symbolic either, but you could use the word illustration or analogy or metaphor. Symbolic is a little too strong for that, and I think you need an explicit biblical verse to draw a symbolic connection, but you can draw a metaphorical connection. So anyway, question, short answer, I don't think so, because the ark was a vessel of divine protection, both in Genesis and both in 1 Peter. But we do have to get to chapter 8, though. So chapter 8, my first question, and you guys can think of questions too when we're going through chapter 8. So my first question is in verse 1, God remembered Noah. So did God forget about Noah? You just have a bad memory, or he's getting old or something like that, senile, and you just forgot about Noah, so I had to remember him? What do you guys think? And why? I know most of you would say, no, God doesn't have a memory like that. He's got a perfect memory. But why? And how do we reconcile that with God remembering?
Right, so there's some things that we believe, obviously very directly, that God is all-knowing, all-loving, all-holy. He is, well, I mean, not all-loving in the sense of loving all things, but I mean, we have certain undeniable and undebatable attributes of who God is, who Christ is, and one of them is all-knowing. So if you deny that God is all-knowing, then you deny his all-powerfulness, that he's all-powerful, that he can know the future, that he knows the past. It's a very core attribute, and there's lots of scriptures to back it up. But so with that in context of keeping the whole of scripture in context, we would then see that in particular and say that God remembered them in a very like, there's a word, I don't know how to say it, effectual or efficient or like working sort of sense. Like that God would remember them in his loving kindness and think kindly towards them and would treat them kindly. I think that's at least somewhat, I think I communicated what it's trying to express.
Yeah, I think you're getting at it. I think you mean that when God remembers someone or something, it means that he's about to do something. there's going to be some kind of action, or effectual, like you said. God's going to effect something. So yeah, while the rest of you are thinking about that, let me just bring up a very handy commentary snippet. This is from Alan Ross's commentary in the CBC. So I'll read Eli's message after this. But reading from the CBC, he says that the verb to remember, or zakar, most often means far more than just a mental recollection. It signifies action based on what is remembered. This is certainly what one would mean in praying, "Lord, remember me." Here the point is that God began to act on what he had promised Noah. So the word itself means more than just mere mental recollection, and especially when we apply that to God, we know that, like Matt said, he can't be forgetting things. He has all of this knowledge already and always at present and always in his mind. So he doesn't have to bring anything to memory or bring up anything from memory either. Rather, the word is focusing on the action and this event that will happen now, God acting. So Eli's question, though, let me read that. There was a book where God remembered Joseph when he was in jail for 2 years. Story of Joseph and the Egyptian who had the dream, chief baker. Yep, that's later on in Genesis. One kept his job and the other was hung on a tree. So yeah, perhaps there are, well, there definitely are, but perhaps we could look at other instances where we see the word remembered. And to do that, you could just do a quick word study. Maybe open up a concordance or whatever, look at that word zakar, and just note every other time that you see that word in the Old Testament. If you want to do a further study, you could look at the Greek of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that Jesus and the New Testament writers often used from time to time. Not all the time, but sometimes. And you could see, okay, are there any parallel words for that in the New Testament, which I think is what the CBC did here, because the New Testament was written in Greek and yet it's citing Luke chapter 23 verse 42, which doesn't use a Hebrew word, I would imagine. Anyway, that would be a further study just for fun if you want to open up a concordance and see all the times where you see that word remember, specifically the word zakar. So my next question, now that we got through verse 1, and it's not really a question, it's more of a statement, but when we look at verses 7 to 12, we see some birds being flown about, being sent out. So Noah first sent out a raven. It flew here and there until the water was dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove, but the dove returned to him. And then he sent out the dove again, and so on and so forth. The dove returned with a freshly picked olive leaf. Then he had to send the dove out again a third time, and the dove did not return. So if you're wondering what the significance of this is, you can look at the IVP commentary, which has some good information for us. So this is basically what seamen would use for navigation. So when you're navigating the waters, you're looking for land specifically, you would send out some birds. So a raven, for instance, they have a longer flight time. And they also didn't need to, well, they could eat carrion, which basically means dead things. And there were a lot of dead things around after the flood. So the raven could survive quite a while out there. So the IVP Bible Background Commentary says that by noting the direction the raven chooses, a sailor may determine where land is located. So the most sensible strategy is to release a raven first, because a raven's use to the seaman is based on its line of flight. So you send out the raven first, and then you use other birds, such as the dove, who had a very shorter flight path and had to return back to where you were at in order to see if the land was really close. So the raven could go to land further away, the dove could go to land that was closer to you. So you send out the raven, you note its flight path, where it goes, its line of flight, and then you can kind of direct your vessel towards that area, or perhaps direct your next bird towards that area. So the habit of doves, the dove and the pigeon have a limited ability for sustained flight, thus navigators use them to determine the location of landing sites. As long as they return, no landing is in close range. So you notice that the dove returned to Noah the first time and the second time, so there's no real suitable landing place for that dove, which meant there was no suitable landing place for the ark either. So let me just read the chat real quick. Okay, we got some random questions in there. We'll try to stay on topic though for now, and then we can get to the random questions later. So yeah, it is very interesting stuff about the birds. And one more interesting thing is that when we do look at ancient Near Eastern literature, so these other flood accounts other than Genesis that were circulating around at the time, such as Gilgamesh and Atrahasis, they also use birds. However, instead of a raven and sending out a dove 3 times, which is what we see in Genesis, we actually see a dove, a swallow, and then a raven sent out in these other accounts. So here's the issue with that. The issue is that you have to send out the raven first. That's the best strategy because the raven has a longer flight path and has a longer line of flight, and you don't know if it has found land, really, because it won't return to you like a dove will most of the time if it has not found land. So you don't know about a raven. It could just keep flying around for who knows how long, and that's kind of the sense we get from Genesis. We just use the raven for its line of flight. That gives us a general direction, then we can send more birds after that. But the raven was sent last in the Gilgamesh and other ancient Near Eastern literature. So it was not ideal at all, and it would rather really be really foolish, actually, because the dove isn't going to do anything if it hasn't found land, so that's going to be very useless. And if you send a raven out last, it's not going to help you. But if you send it out first, you get a general direction, then you use the doves after that to find out whether you've gotten close enough to land. That's a more sensible strategy. And you can see that the Genesis account then is much more realistic than these other accounts that just randomly use birds without any purpose. But in Genesis they have a specific, realistic purpose, and that's just how the ancients did it back in those days to find land. So let's get to some of the random questions real quick then. And we have Solus Spiritus' question that I think he just removed, but he was wondering if Matthew, the book of Matthew, could have been written in Aramaic first. I think that's one of the options that some scholars take. It's not the majority view by any means. The majority view is that it was originally written in Greek, as well as the other Gospels. And there are a lot of reasons for that I'm sure you could look up if you're interested, but we can't really go into that. But yeah, I can answer it more in the Ask Christians channel. And then Eli says, okay, yeah, Genesis 40:41, cupbearer. Remember Joseph. And yeah, perhaps that word remembered was for a human. And at that point in time, since we're talking about a human, the cupbearer did actually forget about Joseph completely. And then he remembered. He had to bring it up to memory. So it wouldn't be a good verse to use about God remembering things. So when you are doing a word study, you got to make sure that the context is fairly similar. But you can also, get a range of meanings for a word, which is good too. So you'd look up every time that God remembers something for a very close word study and what we mean in Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, when God remembered Noah. Anyway, we talked a lot about birds. Any questions on chapter 8 before we get to our last chapter, which is chapter 9? You don't have to think that hard for a question, though. Just if, something concerns you, or you just want to bring up. All right, well, if you are typing question, Okay, that's fine. Let's get to the next section then, and we'll have Dogman read chapter 9, verses 1 to 17.
All right. I'm reading from the ESV. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And you, be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. Every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you. For all future generations I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you, and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all our flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth.
Thanks. So that was Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 to 17. So we see a number of things here. We see that God is now giving permission, allowing animals to be eaten, and with the authoritative command and permission that he gives, he also gives an exception in verse 4. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And he gives kind of the reason for that and everything. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. And you can look at that in a couple ways. I think one of the major significances of that is that we had just got off, as far as the narrative goes, we had just got off the flood account where all of this life had perished and died. And just so that everyone is clear here, life is not cheap. Yeah, we did have the flood, a massive massacre of evil people, but life is still not cheap, and you should not take advantage of that or think of life as cheap because man is made in the image of God. I think that's one of the primary significances of God bringing all of this up here, bringing the exception up about blood and requiring blood from whoever sheds man's blood. That's another good question, Snorlax. How should we apply that to our life? I know someone who is kosher and uses this verse on the animal and lifeblood, on how specific animals should be slaughtered. Probably get a lot more from the law than from Genesis chapter 9 for that. But yeah, that is a good question. What do you guys think? Does this mean that we can't eat blood? Does this still apply to us today in that manner?
Sounds very unappetizing, and I think that there is no reason as to why we should consider that. Like, I think that, yeah, I don't think there's any reason to not believe, like, you know, there would be many, as we all know, blood cults, both old and new, that would have rituals with it. It's just, there doesn't seem to be any sort of custom tradition or anything of the sort to do with actual blood in the New Testament and also in church history. So, I mean, of course, you have the self-flagellation. I don't know how to...
Flagellation?
Yeah, you know, people would whip themselves and, you know, do all sorts of things to try and get God's love and forgiveness and approval. But Nonetheless, ignoring those sorts of things, we don't really see any sort of trend for it. So, blood tastes really good. B. we're a little concerned about. Okay. Basically, yeah, I think it's still in effect for us.
Okay.
So
Yeah, just to bring up an example for all you Westerners. In the Philippines here, we have this dish called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but dinuguan. Maybe B could help me pronounce that. Dinuguan, something like that. And it's basically Filipino pork blood. It's kind of a stew that they make out of the pork blood. Oh yeah, Hibiscus is in here too. He's Filipino too. So yeah, in other places, you have similar blood soups. So they are a thing, in case you were wondering. They are an actual thing today. But yeah, the important question is it okay to do that? Is it permissible to do that? Which is a very different question than, should you be eating pork blood soup? But yeah, is it permissible? So Matt said, well, probably not. Maybe this is still in effect today. And what I would bring up is all the passages in the New Testament, and Enley's already hinting at that. All the passages in the New Testament, like Colossians 2:16 and 17, let no one judge you on the food or drink that you consume. And other passages like in Mark chapter 7, I believe, where Jesus made all foods clean for us. And the passage in Acts that with Peter's dream that he had, where God said, rise up and eat. And Peter said, no, I don't want to eat. I've never eaten anything unclean before. And while that dream was used for the inclusion of Gentiles and making Gentiles clean now, if the initial basis for that, which was the unclean foods, was not true and not correct, then it would follow that God was just messing around and didn't actually make Gentiles clean to the Jews either, just like he wouldn't have made the unclean foods clean. But I do think that God had made the unclean foods actually clean, permissible to eat for Peter, and commanded him to do so. And we do know that God does not tempt people in that way, and does not lie to them or ask them to do things that are sinful. But yeah, no condemnation in Christ.
Yep. Yeah, okay, I will retract my statement. It is not sinful. It is something I do not like to think about, and it is something I will never try, but it is not inherently sinful.
Yeah, and Trinity brings up Romans, which is another good one too, on conscience. So they were talking about meat sacrificed to idols. Some people wouldn't do that because of their conscience. Other people thought it was fine because they knew that an idol was nothing. And to kind of extend that, we know that blood is really nothing. It's just, food, nutrients, or it can be food and nutrients and things like that. We know that it's, really not a big deal because God had made all things clean for us under the new covenant. So, yeah, I guess Matt would be maybe under the weaker conscience, the weaker brethren in this case, so I will try to abstain from eating pork blood in front of you, Matt, so you don't stumble. But yeah, that was a really good question, because questions of application are important. We don't want to be sinning, even unintentionally. So it's a good question to ask. So Sola Spiritus asks, what about if there's food sacrificed to idols, but you are hungry? It just goes back to the conscience again. But I would say if that someone believes that it's wrong, so it goes against their conscience, even though we know from Paul that it's fine to eat meat sacrificed to idols, if it violates someone's conscience, even if they're hungry, even if they're starving, I don't think they should do it, because that would be sin. So yeah, I'd rather someone, myself included, die of starvation than live on in sin. It goes back to kind of Jesus's hyperbolic statements. It's better to go to heaven with one eye than go to hell with two eyes. Similarly, I would say it's better to go to heaven on an empty stomach, die of starvation, than it is to go to hell with a full belly. So, sin is a very serious thing, even if it's just a violation of conscience. And as Paul says, to someone who it is a violation of conscience of, it's sin for him. So I would say I'd recommend that person not eat food sacrificed to idols, or to change his mind first about food sacrificed to idols, and then he can eat that because he's hungry. So, change his mind first, change his conscience first, and then it'd be permissible for him to eat. Yeah, I would think that's fine to pray about it. Definitely important. All right. So yeah, that was a good one to look at. Animals have been allowed for food now. Before it was just plants and things like that. But now after the flood, after Noah and his family had gotten off the ark, God now permits them to eat of animals as well. But he does make that exception with blood. All right. I want to point out a couple things. Verse 9, we looked at the word covenant before last week, and it was only mentioned briefly. We didn't get the full picture of what kind of covenant and how God was establishing with Noah, this agreement that he was establishing with Noah and everything on the earth as well. But in verse 9, we do see that covenant again. Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, every beast of the earth. And he establishes the covenant, verse 11, all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood. So that's specifically, and that's important to remember, because there will be a future consummation where the old earth and heaven will pass away. But he says, never again be cut off by the water of the flood. Neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. And then he gives them a sign of this covenant, which is the bow in the cloud, the rainbow that we're familiar with. And this is the first major covenant mentioned in the Bible. Some people think of, Adam and Eve and the agreement there, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as a covenant too. It doesn't use the word covenant though, but the Noahic covenant is the first major covenant we see in the Bible. I don't think I have any more questions on that to ask you guys, but except one. What does the covenant tell us about God? What do you guys think? What do we learn about God from this covenant? Yeah, he's faithful. He's kept his promise. He's kept his covenant. He's merciful.
Yeah, I think that it shows a sort of special purpose in the flood as an example, but not as something God would continually do. Like, he did it to show forth his holiness and his righteousness, but he made it a covenant so that it would not be done again. Even though he had permission as God to do it again. Like, if the world was so full of wickedness, he could have just flooded it again. But he has decided not to.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I like what Snorlax said too. God thinks human beings are valuable. Wants to protect them. Yeah, really good answers from everyone there. Yeah, really good stuff. Merciful, gracious relationship. Human beings are valuable to him. Even though, as we've seen in chapter 8, verse 21, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth even. Kind of hints back to original sin that we looked at a few chapters back. But yeah, God still cares. Alright, let's get to the last part of chapter 9 now. We read verses 1 to 17, and now we're going to finish it off with 18 to 29. I think we are back to Matt now. So Matt, could you please read verses 18 to 29?
Verses 18 to 29 of chapter 8?
Chapter 9.
7? Oh, chapter 9. Yes, okay. 18 to 27.
29.
Okay.
But yeah, just finish the chapter 20. Off.
Yeah, okay, gotcha. Genesis chapter 9, verse 18. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. Now when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest sons had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of the servants shall he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 350 years, and he died.
All right, thanks. So that was
You're
the
welcome.
ending of chapter 9, and there's a little bit of controversy here. Last bit of controversy that we'll get to today. The question is, what exactly happened in the tent with Ham and his father? Are we talking about Ham merely looking and then telling his brothers about it, or did he do something more sinister? So those are the two main, that's the main question, but there are two main possibilities. There are other possibilities outside of this, but two main possibilities. And Enley's already getting at one of them. So the first main possibility is from, I think, best represented by Robert Gagnon, another biblical scholar. He believes that what happened in the tent was incestuous homosexual rape between Ham and his father. And just a reminder, when we're talking about these things in the chat, please spoiler everything that has to do with non-consensual acts so that it doesn't offend people who have gone through those terrible things personally. So just put a little spoiler there. Yeah. But yeah, that's the first major view, and he lists a number of reasons for that. I won't get into all of the reasons or all of the arguments, but just a few of them. Number one, it seems that Ham was inside the tent. So Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. It specifies that word outside. And the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, it makes that even clearer. It says that Ham went outside to tell his brothers. So the idea there, the implication is that he was actually inside the tent and doing something. And to be inside the tent is to be doing more than simply looking, perhaps. And then the second argument that Gagnon gives is that the verse says that what his youngest son had done to him. And Gagnon notes that that's a very odd verb to use, done to him, if you were just talking about someone looking, merely seeing someone else. That's not really the kind of action that the word done describes. And he also looks at verse 21, where the word uncovered can actually be used in a passive sense. So it would say that he drank of the wine and became drunk and was uncovered inside the tent. Most translations translate it as and uncovered himself inside his tent, meaning that Noah was uncovering himself, but it could also be translated passively in that he was uncovered. We don't know by who or what did that. Could be Noah, could have been someone else. So perhaps in this view on incestuous homosexual rape, we're actually looking at someone else uncovering Noah in the tent in verse 21, and then we see Ham in verse 22. There's a continuation there. So the word uncovering, or seeing the nakedness of, lines up with Levitical phrases denoting sexual intercourse. That's the third argument that Gagnon gives for his position. And finally, and we skipped a couple of his arguments, but finally, this view explains the severity of the curse on Canaan. So you have to wonder, okay, why is the curse so strong if Canaan simply saw his father's nakedness, simply looked at him, and then told his brothers about it? Why did he receive such a grave punishment? And you also have to wonder, okay, why is his son, his descendant, Canaan, cursed, and not Ham himself, who actually did the action? So Gagnon gives the reason: the Canaanites were removed from the land for these kinds of sexual acts. So if you look at Leviticus chapter 18, against incest, against homosexuality, homosexual practice, and whether, with consent or without consent, and also Leviticus chapter 20, that all focuses on the Canaanites, no one else. So it focuses on the Canaanites and those terrible sexual acts, not just merely seeing someone, but acting on that. And another argument that I would add from my own personal list, in verse 24, it says, when Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. Now you have to ask, okay, how did Noah know what his youngest son had done to him? You can't really know if someone looked at you when you weren't aware of it, but you can know if you've been terribly violated in that way. So some translations, though, translate the word knew as learned, and then the implication would be that someone told him what had happened and he learned what had happened. But most translations translate it as knew. He knew what his youngest son had done to him. So yeah, I know this is it's a very rough conversation. I'm sorry about that. We're almost through it though. And we're pretty much through the worst part of it. That was the really extreme act. Not an extreme position, but the position of argument that Gagnon takes, it has a very extreme act attached to it. But we'll get into the lighter act now. That Ham was just seeing his father's nakedness and then, telling his brothers about it in some fashion. Only seeing, nothing else, no doing, no action, nothing like that. So this is the position that the CBC, Cornerstone Biblical Commentary by Alan Ross, takes. So he has a couple arguments for that. So it simply says that Ham saw that his father was naked and went outside and told his brothers. There's not a hint that he did anything physically or sexually to his father. If that were the case, the text would have said that Ham uncovered his father's nakedness, but the text says that Noah uncovered himself. So he takes that kind of translation for the previous verse, whereas Gagnon takes the passive translation where Noah was uncovered. By who? We don't really know. He was just uncovered. But Alan Ross takes the translation that Noah uncovered himself, and he was doing that. He also notes that to the ancients and to religious cultures in the Middle East today, nakedness is disgraceful, and to see the nakedness of one's father would be a breach of family ethic. And that's why Ham's brothers went in backwards through the tent door, and then, covered their father up, not seeing his nakedness. And there are a couple other little arguments. He says that Noah was and this is also a very interesting position. Alan Ross says that Noah was not punishing Ham's son for something that Ham did. Noah used the occasion to prophesy how the descendants of Ham, the Canaanites, would act given this kind of impetus to immorality, this kind of, disposition to immorality, where one of their forefathers was immoral and they kind of got it down the line from him. So that's the second major position on what exactly happened here. And the arguments kind of go back and forth. Gagnon says, well, in the ancient cultures there was nothing that bad about seeing your father's nakedness, nothing that we know of exactly. And perhaps Ham was just, we don't know why Ham was going into the tent either. And the other arguments, they kind of go back and forth. But you can take whatever position you like. I think it would be good to move on for now, though. Unless you guys have questions on it, of course. Just remember to spoiler anything that is part of the rules and things like that. So any questions on chapter 9? Let me just bring up that rule first. So yeah, rule 14. Any questions? Yeah, certainly something to think about. Yeah, you'll see the curse in verses 25 to 27. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. Alright, I will assume no more... Oh, there's one more question. Servant of servants, what exactly does that mean? That's a great question there. And I'm not exactly sure. We can get a little more specific with the Hebrew, perhaps. So it uses two Hebrew words to render that phrase. You have servants plural, and you have servant singular. So it seems perhaps that these, well, there's two options I see here. Either the servants are referring in a positive sense to the descendants of the other two. In that sense, it would be servants of God. Or perhaps it's referring just in general to all servants. Yeah, Canaan would be a servant of all servants. So putting extra emphasis on that. He won't just be a servant, he'll be the servant of servants. He'll be even lower than that. You could also render that word slave instead of servant. It could also perhaps be hinting at war prisoners and things like that. So yeah, I would say servant of servants just means emphasis. So not just any old servant, but a very low kind of servant or slave. Alright, well, I know the last part of chapter 9 was really rough on you guys. It was rough for me too, kind of explaining all of that. But we got through it, and it's part of God's word, so it is important for us to look at and try to discern as carefully and as accurately as we can to kind of piece together what exactly happened in those situations and what was the significance of those. Yeah, don't worry, Pizza, that's not a normal thing that we talk about. Just when something like that comes up in the Bible, which isn't too often. Alright, we covered chapters 7 to 9. We got Noah and his family and all the animals on the ark. They sent out some birds and things like that. The floodwaters subsided. They got out of the ark. God allowed them to eat of animals now instead of just plants and things like that and greens for them. He also gave them a covenant and a sign of that covenant, which was the bow in the clouds. And finally, we looked at some of the options as to what exactly happened between Noah and his son Ham in his tent. So we covered a lot. Next week, we'll probably get through chapters 10 and 11, maybe chapter 12 as well, but definitely 10 and 11. All right. I think that pretty much closes the Bible study out. So Trinity, could you please close us out with a word of prayer?
Okay. Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing us all to come together today and go over your word in Genesis. Thank you for opening our eyes to some new truths and for this class, and thank you guys all for coming, and I hope you stay safe, and yeah, amen.
Amen.